Chapter 2. In a land where everything had already become what it always would be, a boy growing up was a thing of constant change amongst the deafening weight of sameness. However, for Valorian one thing had remained constant to him all this time: he was still the smallest voice in the crowd. Valorian felt smaller still as he looked out from his balcony towards the jagged silhouette of the Borealis Mountains. The peaks began to appear, a slowly sudden moment when the seams of darkness started to unravel the thick blanket of night into the awaiting day. Beyond the mountains lay the outlands. A place Valorian had been told was filled with warlords and monsters and much too dangerous a place for one as young as he. But, he was always left to wonder the truth of it, not that he did not believe the opinion of the elves. But he had also learned from his experiences to test what he was told and not take anything for granted. The elves may believe it completely, but that belief was only a truth from their particular perspective. Not that it mattered to Valorian. Every time he had approached the magical barrier around Ilias, he set off alarms and caused a ruckus from the garrison guards. After too many attempts testing the barrier, he had been watched for nearly a decade after, never allowed a moment without someone checking on his whereabouts. It was like being treated as a child again, and that was something he was eager to move away from. With great reluctance, Valorian was forced to admit that by the standards of elves he actually was just a child. He tried hard to show them differently, show them that he was an adult many times over by human standards, but like most things, there was no sign of change ahead. Valorian's eyes stretched across the kingdom of Ilias and tried to remain content with the vast land he called home. From his balcony, he could see many little pinpricks of light, some in clusters and some out on their own. The tiny pebble-dashed lights marked all the smaller villages and towns spread across the vast territory. There were many places to hide out there, and he knew most of them well, but when the elves were set to a task, they were unshakable. And however nourishing to his curiosity, the treat of gaining a peek at the dangers of the outlands was outweighed by the supervising penalty of constant eyes on him. Valorian watched and waited for the sunrise, just as he also waited for the day when he could venture over those mountains to sample all the wonders he vividly painted in his mind. The keen ears of Valorian heard all the breaths catch as a chorus of sanguine radiance began to slowly stretch across the sky. The anticipation from the crowd of onlookers built in awe. Each fledgling ray of light wrestled to escape the grasp of the clouds as their eagerness grew. The last restraining tethers snapped in a brilliant burst of light. It poured over the awaiting audience as their heightened elfin senses saturated with joy. It was the time of day that elves relished the most, the beginning. Valorian pulled his eyes from the radiating brilliance and focused his attention on the crowds collected on the balconies. Every balcony of the great elf city of Cradle in Ilias was filled. His sharp eyes could make out every elated feature. He looked on as they drew in every second of the moment, enthralled in the wonder of the new day. Matlix had explained that it was at dawn when elves feel the most elemental magic in the air. For 124 years, he had waited for the wonder they spoke of in the sunrise to captivate him so. It was now the year 117,680 GC, the winter neared its end, and as a child of spring, he would soon acknowledge his 125th year of life. If he had been a normal man he would have been long since resting in his grave, but as a dream weaver he had the look of just coming into his prime. Valorian turned to his inner chamber. Books and manuscripts carpeted every flat surface the room afforded. Valorian had little need for sleep and spent most of his nights reading books to entertain himself while the elves of Cradle quietly slumbered. His night's reading was complete, and he had taken another impending step closer to running out of literature and the gradual descent into looming boredom. With a simplistically complex thought, he stretched out his animus to levitate the books and manuscripts from his bed, floors, and surfaces. All at once the collection of literature fell neatly with a reverent touch along the back wall of the room. Valorian walked over and stood in front of his dressing mirror. He stood tall, His muscular definition and large frame singled him out in a crowd, but his unpointed rounded ears still publicized that he was the only non-elf in an all-elf kingdom. His long dark hair and his deep azure eyes could fool them sometimes into forgetting, but eventually, Valorian's abilities always gave him away, as he was the first and only Dreamweaver to have set foot within the kingdom. Valorian had been able to pick out Tililam from his balcony. Tililam would have stared relentlessly at the sunrise. It was always strange to see his martial arts instructor with that expression of utter contentment on his face. The expression he wore when training with Valorian did not seem content, or angry, or happy, or sad. The elf only revealed such emotions during the sunrise. They had yet another swordsmanship trial this morning. This one was slightly earlier than usual in the year, but still well within the expected time, and well within the stable patterns of elfin society. Valorian knew that with the waning moon the previous night, he would need clothing in green or blue for Tililam to see past the big red holes in his vision, so he could at least pretend to parry. Valorian sighed. He supposed that it was as equally as dull an event for Tililam, who certainly appeared to have stopped trying years before to win a contest against Valorian. In each duel, Tililam ended up tagged after only managing a few strokes. The duel would be over long before it really started. When he had started to figure out the way Dreamweavers temporarily dilate, there were few elves that could keep up with him. Tililam was among the fewer than few that could offer a capable challenge. But when Valorian discovered the book The Order of the Furious Blades, no elf, including Tililam, stood much of a chance. If he ever held back, they could tell and would take great insult from such a thing. He had offered the book to Tililam and tried to see if any of the techniques could be adapted for the elfin way, but Tililam graciously refused to even consider it. With Tililam likely dazed for several more minutes, Valorian decided to use the time for his own devices. Before his dressing mirror, he directed his thoughts to the construction of his clothes. The mental image of the Dreamweave became reality as animus energy transmuted into matter from the animo energy model in his mind's eye. The clothes shimmered into existence around him to cast out rolling tones of light. Flickering glimmers licked the air, sending out distortions across the entire spectrum of colors. He stood before the mirror now wearing the Dreamweave he had created, still with streaks of light that washed various colors through the materials as the Dreamweave stabilized into reality. He wore a dark green tunic bound with leather straps, dark leather trousers, and soft tightly bounded boots meant for the swift movement in a duel. He beckoned his transcendent sword Voluma from her resting place sheathed at his bedside. She leapt into his outstretched hand with a distinctive metallic hum as he snatched her from the air. He fastened Voluma across his back and then picked an old withered book from a shelf that ran along his chamber wall. The currents of the air in the room swirled with animus energy that radiated from Valorian. The currents rapidly stiffened as the flow unified all together in the one direction. With a fluid motion, Valorian launched himself through the opening towards his balcony and flew out over the buildings of Cradle. He increased the speed of his flight as he skirted over the many spires, with the flight taking him closer towards the center of Cradle. Elaborate and stunningly crafted buildings and towers, lustrous green patches of tended gardens, cascading waterfalls and erupting fountains, all hurtled by beneath him in graceful glimpses of aesthetic elfin magnificence. As Lysis, the monolithic ivory tower in the center of Cradle, consumed his view, he swiftly burst upwards and left a hazy visible wake of animus that fizzed in the air. His dynamic motion marked with a trail of distorted light bent around the force. He climbed parallel with Lysis, the air chilled as he ascended. As he passed the summit of the giant tower, he slowed slightly to peer through the large glass windows. The top of Lysis contained the council chambers where the elders gathered to discuss, talk, communicate, and most importantly to frequently deliberate. It struck him in the moment, as his eyes looked inside the empty chamber, that most of the elves were behaving like Tililam. They were content to continue the motions required, each satisfied to repeat the same tasks with no new knowledge or methodology to bestow. A feeling of waiting always attached itself to their instructions to him. It was all just filling in time, a thing that held his thoughts captive as it gave him the sensation that his aimless life was becoming a thing that merely loitered in existence. Valorian poured more energy into his climb. The stream of animus behind him gleamed with saturation until finally, the watchtower came into view. A marvel of elemental engineering, it was shaped with a central axis with several spires protruding from the top at different angles. Each axis pointed towards the various stars beyond. The effect focused the shape downwards, to the upside-down tower Messis, the mirror image of Lysis, which pointed towards its counterpart in the center of Cradle. In between the many spires at the top of Messis was the habitat sphere. It was imbued with constantly changing colors that radiated from its center and reflected off its gleaming surface. The facade seemed to dance to a silent melody only shared privately between the dazzling light and the polished exterior. Valorian spiraled the length of Messis as he ascended, steadily reducing in speed. Situated between the sky and the darkness beyond, the massive structure had the important task of maintaining the barrier between the Outlands and the Elfin nation. "Matlix! It's Valorian shouted, reducing the flow of animus propelling his body as he descended onto the ground floor tier of the habitat sphere. The sound of his voice echoed from floor to floor, hall to hall, right to the centermost auditorium and back. Moments passed in silence, and Valorian received no response. Valorian drew upon his dream-weaving senses. Centering his being to the surrounding environment, he began to suffuse his sensitive animo energy with his surroundings and rapidly extended it outwards in search of Matlix. He transcended his own body and permeated every molecule in the surrounding habitat. The gentle tide of anima ran his mind across every surface. The soft anima rivulet allowed him to feel the texture of the walls, fixtures, devices, tools, furniture, and even follow the smooth-flowing configurations of Matlix's sculptures. Valorian's eyes opened quickly and his head tilted back. He looked up at an unassuming part of the ceiling, the scope and reach of his anima vision showing him what lay beyond the visible surface, to the observation deck at the top of the Messis sphere. Invisible animus limbs projected from his body to push and pull him from the ground floor tier. He moved through the structure as if effortlessly swimming. He floated up stairwells, soared along the hallways, and emerged eventually through the opening onto the observation deck. At the furthest point along the deck, Valorian's anima vision and his eyes of flesh shared the same sight. Matlix crouched over his instruments. Matlix lifted his left arm and casually pointed towards a brown leather case. "Set it with the others," Matlix said, as he waved his arm for Valorian to come closer. "Come, child, Ocuteam and Metapus are about to collide. I've been waiting over 1,700 years for this. Take a seat. Started about 5 days ago. The gravitational forces are astronomical. Come see. I never predicted their swirl dynamics to be sympathetic frequencies." "I'm unable to stay long, Matlix," Valorian interjected. "Till Alarm still wishes to perform regular trials, so I reluctantly must be on my way," Valorian elaborated, unable to cover up the whine that found its way into his tone. He walked over and placed the book on top of the case Matlix had indicated. "Yes, Tilly and the others tend to overlook progression," Matlix grumbled, unrelenting in his attention to the various activities that leapt from the console before him. "May I return once I'm finished with my trials?" Valorian requested. Matlix did not respond to Valorian's question, and not for the first time Valorian found himself leaning back with his mouth gaping as he looked upwards and outwards into the blinding dark of the great abyss, fruitlessly trying to see what engrossed his favorite mentorso. Abruptly Matlix swung around on his chair. "Of course, child. I have a mind to put a grievance against Tilly for dulling your mind with futile actions, he said with his finger thrusting vigorously as if he were engaged in a fencing contest with Tilly as he spoke. Then, with a final killing lunge, he zestfully swung the chair back around to his instruments once again. "Thank you, Matlix," Valorian said as he bowed. "Oh, and Val," Matlix shouted from the side of his mouth just when Valorian turned to leave. The moments passed by and Matlix said nothing more, with his head dipped forward into an eyepiece that seemed to make Matlix a part of the device. "Be a good boy and bring some food and drink when you come back. My supplies up here ran out yesterday, and I can't leave to go to the cellar below. It could happen at any second, child," he said with a childish glee. Go. Hurry along now. I can barely remember the last time I ate or drank something, so don't be too long with Tilly." Even as Matlix was just about finished his request, Valorian put the final touches to the anima concept in his thoughts, before overlaying the conceptualized anima energy with animus energy. The magical dreamweave shimmered into reality from the pocket of fifth-dimensional space held open within Valorian's pentaract. A dazzling display of glinting starlight luster sparkled and flashed into being. A tray with Matlix's favorite treats appeared beside his control console. The food and drink released a multitude of vapors and irresistible smells as the physical form swam in a watery spectrum of radiance. Matlix's movement was practically instantaneous. As he turned, he began to feast, a delicacy slotted into his mouth as he looked behind him. The deck was empty, with no sign of Valorian. No pear drops again, Matlix muttered under his breath as he inspected the tray before returning to his work. Valorian gracefully landed on the balcony of the outer gallery in the game's courtyard. He took a seat on the first row of smooth granite pews to wait. From his seat, he looked out across the game fields. The vast oval-shaped court was surrounded by high walls topped with rows upon rows of benches of various designs. The narrow ends of the oval courtyard were each segmented into 4 quarter-circle fields, dissected by smooth wet-shined pathways centering on the remaining 2 sections raised in the middle strip, with a circular pavilion at one end and a square platform at the other. The elders had an elaborate loggia placed above the rounded pavilion that broke the continuous surrounding balcony. The location allowed the elders to watch the proceedings during the yearly games with the respect afforded to their seniority. A few of the younger elves, only just past 1,000 years, gathered on the square platform and exchanged greetings. With preparations made, and a conductor chosen, the collection of elves began their morning exercises in perfect unison. The elemental forces involved gradually generated gusts of wind as the moves became more complex. Valorian watched them practice. Having watched the familiar sight so many times, the view no longer held any novelty to him. Despite his best efforts, Valorian gained a twinge of annoyance every time he saw them practice. It forced him to recall all the struggles when he was young. The elves performed the vastly complex elemental forms for temporal dilation with ease. They had tried to teach him how to dilate his temporal constant by elf in ways that calculated the elemental balance, rather than just feeling it. Now, any thought towards participating in such exercises made him slightly defensive and abundantly resentful. He tried to not let others see how he reacted, but sometimes all the memories of inadequacy hit him like the beginning of a panic attack. His perfect recollection would play out all the disappointing looks from his teachers once again. To find a remedy, Valorian filled his mind with the excited scream of joy he had made in that moment when he had dream-woven his first cup of tea for Matlix. Only for Matlix to ban him from his private study after all the damage he had caused as the cup and the tea had dropped on top of Matlix's table and books. It had been only one of many lessons he had taught himself: never dreamweave objects into midair. He smiled, recalling all the times that Matlix had to fix things Valorian broke as he had learned, but the books Matlix kept were the only way for Valorian to learn. Matlix had an entire room in the watchtower filled with books on the magics of men, Rose, shelves and stacks of glorious books that Valorian had placed in his eidetic memory like a warm embrace. On the subject of dream-weaving, it took several lifetimes to learn to dream-weave as readily as Valorian could, but according to all the literature, Valorian was nothing short of nonpareil. After all the years of failure, the thing hardest for him to accept was that in matters of dream-weaving, Valorian was nothing short of exceptional. From very early on in his own training, he had been able to conceptualize the animo energy into a functional configuration within his pentaract. All the boring educational books he had been forced to read provided him with an understanding few could achieve. He applied every tiny scientific detail needed, so when it came time to add animus energy, the matter seemed eager to manifest into reality from his pentaract. Valorian's skills also extended to dreamcasting thoughts to and fro in others' mind. The skill to dreamcast had found many uses throughout his further education. Dreamcasting allowed Valorian and elfin experts to communicate better and share techniques and memories for Valorian to translate into a suitable dream-weaving technique. Although, most did not often repeat the act, as the turmoil of Valorian's chaotic thoughts was too much for some elves to cope with. As his ability had grown, so had a want to prove himself to everyone who had only ever witnessed his failures. The want was so strong a thing that it could be easily mistaken for a need. It was something his old tutors never understood, with attempts to demonstrate his newfound skills being viewed as boastful and egotistical. After all this time they still denied him any sort of recognition for skills that surpassed most, if not even all, elfin magical techniques. Valorian shook his head and tried to shake himself loose from the old thoughts. He could get so swept up in all the ways that they had failed to accommodate him, he would find himself consumed with negative thoughts for days if not careful. Those moods were becoming too frequent, and he was trying hard to avoid them lately. After watching the elaborate temporal performance for a few minutes, Valorian's anima feelers sensed Tilalam's presence approach long before he could see him. Tilalam entered the courtyard from the instructor's arch and walked straight onto the pathway leading to the platform and the pavilion in the center. He carried his sword Solon sheathed in his left hand. Tilalam was the physical standard that all the other elves referred to as redundant. He was a solid coat of muscular armor, covering a collection of taut springs that were ready to uncoil at the slightest provocation. His most striking feature was his stern unanimated face that he displayed to the world. Gone was the smile at his enjoyment of the sunrise, with the unanimated face helping him gain the control and precision of the warrior discipline. Long jet black hair framed his face with the same traditional swordsman style as Valorian. Tilalam was a creature of utter habit, and if people scheduled it properly his time was something he would give freely, but it was never wise to interfere with his routine. Tilalam paused momentarily as he directed his gaze towards Valorian's waiting place, with no hesitation to the location. "Come." The sensation of Tilalam's voice echoed through the perfectly balanced elemental currents of water, fire, and air, which projected into Valorian's mind. The familiar call came to Valorian in a way that sounded akin to a voice shouting across a great chasm. Tilalam continued his marching pace with bold strides, sending his dark blue cloak forward with each stride only to whip back again. Valorian, driven by all the years of training, naturally focused on Tilalam's approach. It was an almost instinctive act now, a cool and calculated appraisal of an opponent, which searched for any kind of weakness. Valorian's hearing singled out the rhythm of Tilalam's cloak. It made a subtle textural sound, like a bat's wings drumming the air. Tilalam's robe was a lighter shade of blue to his cloak, with striking golden thread used for his string ties that bound the loose folds of material from his waist upwards. Tilalam left his lower half unchecked, the robe's length meant to conceal his legs. A purposefully done thing Valorian knew, so the position of Tilalam's feet and legs did not betray his next move during the duel. It was an inadvertent game played between them for years, Make strength appear as weakness and weakness appear as strength. Till-Alarm had trained Valorian to think this way. Valorian's thoughts were always working to anticipate, working with a warrior's focus to always be thinking, and never idle. Before the fight ever began, the duel was long underway. Expectations offered the opportunity for manipulation, just as those expectations could, in due course, be used as intellectual bait for traps. Valorian sprang from his seat near the Elder's loggia, then scaled a balcony barrier with a single step before he took another off the edge into the empty air. He landed on the pathway beside the pavilion with little effort, as if casually dropping from a knee-high box. He walked straight towards the steps scaling the pavilion, where he had been meeting with Till-Alarm for just less than 117 years. His enthusiasm for attending these sessions had waned somewhat over that time, but he never wanted Till-Alarm to learn that from him directly. Till-Alarm and Valorian converged on the spot with an equal pace. Valorian presented himself before Till-Alarm and performed the greeting of a novice pupil to his master. "The morning's light is upon you, Master Till-Alarm," Valorian pronounced. With his left arm placed along his left side, he placed his right hand over his heart and made a lavish flowing gesture with his arm that moved outwards towards Till-Alarm, followed by a deep bow, which he maintained. "May the coming day favor you, Master Valorian," Till-Alarm said as he performed an identical gesture to Valorian. Valorian snapped his head up to catch the last few movements. Ordinarily, Till-Alarm would have said "Rise and greet the day, child," whilst he extended his right arm, cupped his palm and pulled it towards his heart. Till-Alarm had just greeted Valorian as an equal, just a casual meeting between two acquainted master swordsmen. In symmetry, each closed their hands into fists and brought them to rest against their chests. "You seemed shocked, young Valorian," Till-Alarm observed, as he displayed an amused smile at Valorian's surprise. "I am honored, Master," Valorian managed to squeeze through a joyous full-bodied smile of his own. "This will be our first true contest, Valorian. I recognize you now as a master swordsman in your own right," Till-Alarm said as he dipped his head in respect towards Valorian with a slight tilted curve as it dropped. "Although you are still so young, such skill and ability can no longer go without formal acknowledgement." "Thank you, Master," Valorian offered in response. Till-Alarm drew his sword Solon from her sheath. "It has taken nearly 40 seasons of petitioning the elders to accept my recommendation for your advancement," he said as frown lines invaded his brow. He flurried Solon as he turned and with one hand twirled his cloak from his shoulders, to place the cloak over the carved wooden post that led up towards the pavilion. Valorian's expression changed dynamically, broadcasting an ever-increasing quagmire of questions that vied for supremacy on his lips. Till-Alarm extended Solon before him, inspecting its condition for any crack of fracture. He found none on the finely crafted double-edged blade. Not a single flaw on the inch-and-a-half thick metaphysical metal, from tip to the hilt. Past Solon's rounded guard, a two-handed hilt allowed Till-Alarm to hold her with delicate force. Solon fitted Till-Alarm's frame and fighting style completely, just as similar dimensions fitted with Valorian, embodied in Valorian's transcendent sword Vilama. "Well?" Till-Alarm inquired, as he raised a quizzical eyebrow. Valorian abruptly became conscious that he had not moved a muscle since the completion of the greeting. The knuckles of Valorian's right hand turned white as he held his prideful fist against his pounding chest. I apologize, Valorian blundered his words. "Come Valorian, ready yourself," Till-Alarm chided in a stern voice, fixing Valorian with a hardened stare. "Don't fumble around with a child's gratitude." He softened his features and smiled at Valorian, the words reminding himself as well. "Accept your new status with grace, but most importantly composure," he advised in a gentler tone. Valorian smiled, dipping his head with respect towards Till-Alarm, keeping his head straight as it dropped, as an act of deference to him. My teacher continues to teach as always. Does he indeed? Till-Alarm queried as he rolled his eyes. When you're quite ready, Till-Alarm commented, with utter immunity to the attempted flattery. I'm ready, Master, Valorian confirmed. You must address me by name now, Valorian. Yes. Till-Alarm, Valorian said, sounding out Till-Alarm's name as if saying it for the first time. Till-Alarm's expression became more formal in response. A line had been crossed, and Valorian suddenly realized that he was Till-Alarm's peer, his brother-in-arms. A master must not, under any circumstances, use spatial blade forms whilst practicing with a pupil, Till-Alarm said as he raised his chin and looked towards the inner city. The elders wisely decided this, as pupils who don't have the proper control could harm themselves whilst defending an attack, despite the protective wards, he explained, pointing Solon at Valama. Valorian automatically twisted his head to look behind his right shoulder to Valama's hilt. If a counterstroke isn't measured properly, you run the danger of your own blade striking you. Till-Alarm cautioned. The words filled the quiet long enough to press the weight of his warning on Valorian. This is to do with the Order of the Furious Blades, the book I found in the library. Valorian volunteered towards the explanation. Some of the techniques I learnt from it could have such a consequence. Yes, the Furious Blades style of the liquid blade is similar to what elves call spatial blade forms, Till-Alarm instructed, adopting a lecturing tone. The principles are almost identical. They only differ in their method of execution. Valorian began to say something and then seemed to pause in thought for a moment. So you've been able to use spatial blade forms this entire time? Yes, Till-Alarm said flatly. So, you could have countered the liquid blade style of the Furious Blades? Valorian retorted, summarizing the past 40 seasons of frustration. Yes, Till-Alarm answered again, the inanimate expression hid many things, but repeatedly engaging in a contest whilst handicapped over and over all this time made for some obviously shared frustration. Does my recent advancement entitle me to some answers as to what this order did? Valorian asked. Every time I have asked before, I've been told that what I need to know is in the book. But the main body of work relating to their beliefs and identities was ceremoniously damaged. All I know for sure is that they were knights and magic wielders, and that's all. There's no mention of them in any other book I'm allowed. That is all you need to know for now, Till-Alarm declared. Yes, but surely I should be allowed to know who were the people behind the swords and spells? Valorian's hands animated his words as he spoke. What did they stand for? Were they good or evil? They were individuals, and responsible for their own actions. Drawing some collective conclusion about them is probably the very reason the book was so ceremoniously damaged. Each person alone is responsible for all the actions or inactions they choose, either for good or evil, Till-Alarm explained. The responsibility may rest with the individual, but the group. Surely the group itself must have had a tendency due to the founding purpose. Valorian pressed. Even so, an entire group must not be held accountable for the actions of a few, or the few for the actions of the group, Till-Alarm said, shaking his head to convey he would not soon waver on this issue. I agree with your defense of the individual, but that does not change the responsibility upon the collective. If what the creed teaches is evil, then those principles will produce subscribers with varying degrees of corruption. If this is the case, then the practices of the group must be stopped, Valorian argued, with a polish to the argument between them having received much practice over the years. Why must you remain so curious about them? Till-Alarm asked in deflection. I found the book, so I have no qualification to the reasoning behind the information contained within it. If the techniques were meant for malevolence, I prefer not to use them, Valorian revealed. Ugh. Well, how wonderfully pious of you. Till-Alarm taunted playfully. his stern face barely containing a near smile of amusement. There was an evident change in his demeanor. "I placed the book on the windowsill by your favorite table in the library so you would find it." "You put it there?" Valorian asked. "Yes, it was something you had to study and learn for yourself. I, nor any other elf, could teach you the techniques in it. To learn elfish spatial blade forms would have been detrimental to your rendering during combat," Tilalam answered. Valorian nodded as he listened. "So its qualification is awarded by me," Tilalam proclaimed, whilst he performed a mockingly shallow bow. "Liquid blade style is a very potent technique. It produces much more force, therefore, it needs more energy." Tilalam walked over to stand before Valorian. "Draw Velima and let us begin. You should find this contest more interesting." Valorian smiled to himself as he drew Velima from her sheath. That was the end of the conversation for Tilalam, but Valorian was already thinking about which elves he could continue this discussion with upon a time. He had learnt that using information collected from one he could bait another into thinking he knew more than he did. Other times simple rash conclusions proved beneficial. The conclusions did not need to be right, for they would provide the particulars he needed as they set about correcting such misguided and erroneous interpretations. Velima began to breathe freely as Valorian held her. She vibrated with satisfaction at the prospect of use. He had read many stories with swordsmen in them, and many named the swords to give them personality. They often liked to try and get the reader to think about the swords as a character in the story. When very young, he had once had a conversation with a cutlery knife just in case it was alive and he might hurt its feelings. The conversation had been entirely one-sided of course, as the knife was no more alive as any of the swords that common swordsmen named. But, with transcendent swords, the notion actually held some merit. A transcendent sword was a part of their wielders. The energy imbued in them during forging, responded to the forger during combat like it was a living creature. It could only ever work for the one who made it, which is why before Valorian could become a master swordsman, he became a master artisan. The energy in the blade allowed the swordsman to manipulate the blade's metaphysical presence beyond the mere physical. Rather than striking the reach of the blade, it could extend its effective range just by the swordsman providing additional power. It had taken Valorian many years to form such a unified harmony with his transcendent sword Velima. He had attained what all swordsmen yearned for, a merging of blade and thought. Velima was the consequence to Valorian's impetus. Tilalam climbed the steps up one side, his focus held on a simple bronzed figurine on a pillar at the top. The figurine had outstretched arms and opened palms. He touched the flat of Solan's blade to the figurine's upturned palms and waited. Valorian followed behind Tilalam and did the same with Velima in turn, the flats of both transcendent swords resting one on top of the other. The air around the two swordsmen buzzed. The metallic song of both of the swords built together in intensity before ceasing in a sharp silence. Tilalam and Valorian removed their swords from the figurine's palms and made their way to the very center of the pavilion. They stood opposite each other and saluted with their swords. The protective wards of the pavilion's containment field, now covered each of them in the complementary frequency of the other's blade edge to guard them against harm, and in kind, the arena also. It was the only way to practice with the unstoppable cutting edge of transcendent swords. If struck by the opponent's blade, the edge would find no purchase, redirecting the cut away from them harmlessly. Tilalam unleashed his temporal constant, increasing his rate of progression in time. He had built up the elemental energy slowly, to go unnoticed by Valorian. The cunning elf, now so swiftly dislodged from time, hurled himself backwards and upwards at fantastic speed. He brought Solan downwards to send a barely visible thread of inexorable force from Solan's blade towards Valorian. Valorian rapidly dilated his own temporal constant, animus charged into his tesseract, pushing him faster in time. For the outside world it was like they became ghostly blurs, but for them, It was like slowly opening eyes to a world of stillness. Valorian's rate of progression in time matched Till-Alarm's within an instant. Clouds that raced by overhead before, now slowed to a crawl, then stiffened to motionlessness. The silhouettes of shade that once danced along the stone floor a moment earlier, turned to a sluggish gloom and then seemed to stop entirely. Upon registering Till-Alarm's movements, Valorian intuitively sidestepped the ethereal slash and fell into a roll to return to his feet in a better stance. This was not the first time Till-Alarm had bolted into action. He had used the ploy before to attempt to overwhelm Valorian and gain an advantage. It was not the first, but it was certainly the most effective yet. As Valorian righted himself, he held Volumnia primed in a two-handed grip. With a raging roar, Valorian sliced low, a wake of fluid silver blanketed towards Till-Alarm's predicted landing point, the elf's movement slower than Volumnia's horizontal liquid blade swipe. Till-Alarm surprised him again by managing a somersault midair. The wave of liquid blade passed by harmlessly beneath him like a glistening mirror. As Till-Alarm landed, he bounced off the ground straight towards Valorian. Solon was outstretched before him, the blade released slice after slice of metaphysical spatial blade in a deadly whirlpool. Valorian flung himself to meet Till-Alarm's attack, with Volumnia held foremost as he performed complementary counter-circles of liquid blade in an opposite direction to the elfin spatial blade forms. A series of silver spirals flowed from Volumnia. Her liquid blade reflected the surrounding environment across her mirrored surface as the swirls coalesced into a narrow whirlpool of razor edges. The vortexes met. Both swordsmen tightened their formations as a maelstrom of energy built between them. A shockwave exploded in all directions to send a wave of chaotic energy out and slam against the protective field around the pavilion. Caught by surprise on the platform, the elves snapped their heads towards the pavilion as the containment field that surrounded the pavilion bursts to life with a loud detonation. The air suddenly filled with deep percussions and tingled with elemental energy. A wave of upheaval sent out tremors across the stone pathways, particles of dust dislodged as the wave shuddered the very ground. The elves looked at each other first, sharing confused expressions. All their glistening eyes locked on the pavilion as their faces reflected the watery spectrum of color emitted from the field, which strained greatly from the effort. Dazzling flares of light beckoned the elves, who hopped off the platform to run towards the pavilion with an excited haste. They looked for the source of the upheaval through the pulsating field, searching for an explanation as they watched in astonishment as two unsubstantial forms leapt and spun around within. Transcendent swords slashed and parried as the forms defied gravity and moved at nearly incomprehensible speeds. The air filled with the frantic drumming thuds and ringing metal, the sound of the ringing heard like millions of large metal needles being poured over a hard stone surface. Individual pings and pangs added together to bring a high-pitched hum to their ears. Till-Alarm shocked the audience as he slammed into the containment field. A shape-warping wave spread across the field, which forced the surprised onlookers to recoil. He staggered forward slightly as Valorian suddenly materialized in the center of the pavilion. Valorian stood side-on to Till-Alarm, Volumnia held in his right hand upside down, with the blade across his back peeking over his shoulder like a shining dagger. Valorian observed and waited. He studied his opponent, like a cat that was playing with a mouse. He predicted Till-Alarm's next move and waited for the right moment. Till-Alarm soared towards Valorian in an attack. An arcing wave of spatial blade form that sailed towards Valorian as he brought Solon upward underarm. The wave cut the air with a whistle as he pulled the ethereal ribbon onwards and upwards underneath him. Valorian remained still and motionless, his doom seemed set. Till-Alarm moved at an incredible speed. The advantage was his. The smallest of triumphant smiles pulled at the corners of his mouth. Valorian's acceleration was a blur of kinetic mystery. He exploded into the air. He vaulted and rotated over Till-Alarm as he swung Volumnia around his back to end up in both his hands hefted high over his head. It took a flip and a spin, but Valorian soon found himself with the advantage. Till-Alarm, barely able to see the powerful clubbing blast of thickened, almost syrupy, liquid blade meant for Till-Alarm's exposed back. Till-Alarm was cannoned face first into the field, which molded to the stunned elf's shape to soften the impact. The field returned to its original shape, with Till-Alarm expelled backwards into the pavilion. Valorian sheathed Voluma quickly as he ran to his fallen opponent to kneel beside him. "Are you okay, Master?" Valorian asked whilst he projected his animo energy, his senses extended to Till-Alarm to evaluate his condition. "That was X. Hill.Irating," Till-Alarm said, panting. The dazed elf smiled as he tried to draw in as much air as possible. "Haven't performed at that level of competition in a millennium," he said as he continued to pant from the exertion. "Don't speak, Master, wait until you get your breath back," Valorian suggested. "Don't call me Master," Till-Alarm chided. "Sorry, Till-Alarm," Valorian said as he hooked his forearms under Till-Alarm's shoulders and lifted him upright. "No need to apologize for it. Just don't do it again," Till-Alarm suggested as he placed his legs firmly on the ground and took his own weight. "But a splendid performance, young Valorian," he said with sluggish demeanor. "Do you need any healing?" Valorian asked, still with a protective hand like a cradle on Till-Alarm's back. Till-Alarm reached his arm over Valorian's shoulder. "A fine idea, but better leave it to one of the other elves," he said as he patted his hand on Valorian's back to ease concerns. "You must be drained after that." Valorian smiled as he helped Till-Alarm over to the flight of steps to descend from the pavilion. He dropped the containment field that still surrounded them. The gathered elves flooded in and clustered around the two combatants to help Till-Alarm down the flight of steps. Shadowy figures watched on from the Elder's Loggia as the crowd swept Valorian away towards the healing station. Till-Alarm and the other elves shouted compliments at the expert techniques Valorian had used the entire way. Valorian received many compliments from the elves. They could not readily believe his speed and strength. The procession passed from view through a white archway, leaving the games fields to silent reflection. The dark silhouetted figures seamlessly dissolved from view, to return to the shadows, only to leave mysterious intentions in the wake of their absence.